Hello and welcome back. My name is Sean and today we're diving into another cosmere villain. Specifically, the Fused. The Fused are one of the main antagonists in the Stormlight archives taking place in Roshar, and they function generally as a counterpart to the Knights Radiant and the Heralds. And I wanted to do a video on them because I think they're one of the coolest villains antagonists that you can find in any fantasy series. They're not my favorite in the cosmere universe. I actually did a video on my favorite actually is, but I think if you zoom out and are a fan of Brandon Sanderson in general, you know that not only does he do magic systems very well, but he also does races and villains and just makes these really memorable, well fleshed out characters that he pitches his heroes against. And I think the Fused are a prime example of that. So I wanted to dive into some of the details of why I think they're such good antagonists. But as a spoiler warning, some of the details I will be revealing about the Fused actually are up to the latest book in Stormlight, which was Rhythms of War at the time of this video. For you people watching this in the future, I would highly recommend just reading, catching up however far behind you are, because there will be some pivotal details that will be released in this video that would spoil the experience for you. Still minor, but I think one of the cool parts of the Stormlight archives is just how it unfolds, so don't do yourself that disservice. Go watch something else that I did that will not spoil this situation, and then just continue on. For everyone else, let's go ahead and dive in. The Fused are the souls of the ancient, most legendary warriors of the first desolation, and are reborn into the world of Roshar through the use of possession. That's why they are called the Fused. They basically are cognitive shadows, and so when you have a willing host, they are able to go in and possess that body, basically ejecting the other person's soul in the meantime. And due to the fact that they are cognitive shadows underneath Odium, they are very similar to Spren. And if you don't know too much about what that actually entails, I'll actually link a video down below. There's a guy whose whole channel is dedicated to cosmere lore, and he does his videos very well. I highly recommend checking him out for more detail. But generally you can think of them as Spren, so they can get their power directly from Odium. Unlike a Knights Radiant who needs to bond with a Spren to get their powers through Stormlight, they are able to access it directly through Odium, which makes them pretty potent. So as cognitive shadows, they are essentially immortal. In the earlier desolations, whenever you would kill one, it would return back to its home planet of Braze, which, if you don't know, is basically hell. It's a separate planet out that the souls of them would get sent back to, and it was a very hellish place. You don't want to be there. It just sounds like a very miserable thing, but one of the reasons they wanted to get out of there was to escape it. And it's actually a major plot point for the heralds, because they would have to kill every single Fuse that there was at the time, have them sent back to Braze in a timely fashion, and then also return to Braze with the use of an oath pact, keep everyone sealed inside. But with the events of the books that I'm not going to go too much into, they out now. They free, and through Odium's use of the Everstorm, they are able to, even if you kill them, they can simply return back into the Everstorm and not go to hell, and doing whatever general villain things they were doing before. Couple caveats with that. So every time they do die and they have to get reborn and translated, their spirit gets damaged a little bit more each time. And that will manifest itself as differing forms of insanity. So if some of these Fused, with all their ancient power and skill that they have, are becoming more and more unhinged every time they die, and in a war against a growing Knights Radiant, that seems to happen more and more, and it really presents itself in very interesting ways. Raboniel and Leshley, I think, are very good examples of this, and each different Fused has their own quirks. Some go straight sadist killer, others are just blubbering and just completely useless, and others are just become terrifying in their psychopathy. Now, before I get into more details, I'm going to break this video up into parts. So before we get into what exactly powers that the Fused have and what makes them so terrifying, I wanted to take a step back and talk a little bit about the Parshendi and the Singers specifically, dive into how surges work, and then diving into how their power works specifically, along with diving into little bits of lore and going into even more detail about these creatures. So on Roshar, predating humans, there were the Parshendi. They had a very interesting physiology where they actually possessed gem hearts, and they had a pretty cool balance between them and the Spren, and lived pretty harmoniously. But one day, the humans came and just completely wrecked everything, because the Spren, before, when all they had known was that they could reside inside of a Parchment's gem heart, and be locked in but still get to experience the physical realm. With humans, they found that they were actually able to make these connections with them and have the freedom to just explore and not be locked inside of a gem heart. Now, for the Parshmen, that was a very bad thing, because that meant that all the good spren and all the sprens that they actually needed for their culture and the best choices were going to choose the humans instead, because the humans provided more freedom for the spren. So they were understandably upset, especially given like how Parshman physiology works. One thing to keep in mind is that the Parshmen have different forms that they can take on, and with their gem heart they have an innate symbiosis with spren. So depending on the type of spren that they actually infuse themselves with, it grants a different type of form. The worst form that they can have is when they don't have any type of spren inside them at all. So without a spren, they are just incomplete and just feel really terrible and awful. And this physiology is very important, because with that ability to bond different spren in their gem heart, this is the method in which the fused actually come back and take over. Before we go into how that actually happens, I wanted to briefly go over the different forms that you could assume. So the ones that we actually know, there is a difference between common and power forms. Common forms are more normal spren that you would find just anywhere on Roshar, but then you have void spren, which makes them assume forms of power. And these void spren come directly from Odium, so they grant more power in general, but they also come with a lot more strings attached. But getting into some of the common forms, you had Dole form, Mate form, War form, Work form, Nimble form, Meditation form, Scholar form, Art form. Now, a lot of these were lost to the Parshendi in the Desolation, so when Odium wasn't in the picture, a lot of what they could do before they lost because they were afraid of reigniting the power that Odium had over them. The ones that we see throughout the series early on would be like War form and Work form. And basically when these Parshendi would take on these different forms, their mental aspect, their personalities, how they handle emotions, how patient they are, all of it gets affected by the different forms they have. They are highly influenced by these different spren that they take into themselves and bond. This is important because when you get into the forms of power like Storm form, Night form, Smoke form, Decay form, or Envy form, and basically taking in these void spren from Odium, you're now allowing a major influence from this very angry, power-hungry god to come in there, and it just really influences their decisions, and you start to see these regals, or that's what it's called, when a Parshendi takes a form of power, just start to have that heavy influence and they go a little bit crazy. And part of like how they're influenced by the different spren and the different types of forms, there's something really interesting that happened in the books that I wanted to briefly talk about that's not directly related to the fused, and that was during the Awakening, when the Everstorm came open and then all of the Parshendi finally woke up and stopped being in their Dole form. Depending on whatever land they awakened from, they actually took on the characteristics of that land they were part of. So with the Alethi, the Mongol type horde that were just all about war and battle, when the Parshendi woke up there, they were seizing the capital, they were attacking, they were angry, they were like any other Alethi. But if you started to go up to some of the more bureaucratic states or some of the others, then they actually would then petition the government or act like any citizen of that land would. So they are very much influenced by the land and the things surrounding them. So when they were among humans, even the humans influenced them. So when they were fully awoken, they proceeded to act like a normal human would in that situation, which not related to the fused. I just thought that was very fascinating, and I'm excited to see what happens next with it. Now, when the fused came back, they basically took over most of this hierarchy. The Parshendi had a very particular form of like governance where they had a different council, but it was very symbiotic and stuff. They would have different type of leaders, but it all went out the window the moment like Odium came back and brought the fused with them. So at the very tippy top, we had Odium. He has a few other major creatures that we're not sure like where they fall in the hierarchy compared to like the Council of Nine, but speaking directly with the Parshendi, you have Odium, the Council of Nine, the Fused, the Regals, and then the general Parshendi, and you have a few human allies and stuff, but generally the motive of the Fused is just to completely eliminate humanity. So Not a big fan, but the Council of Nine, I've mentioned a few times, it is an elective council that they have made completely of the fused. The Nine entome themselves in stone pillars in an atrium through soul casting. But basically they are the council that has the final say on any proposals brought before them by the fused. And we know that they can be elected in there if you have enough influence, you can join or get kicked out of it. Rebonial was such a fuse that actually was on the council. But even with this insanity and with Odium in charge and with the pending extension of humanity on their mind, they still would organize. They had their own culture. When the fused were coming back, they were able to actually start bringing back some of the ancient traditions that they have, and Rebonial example was a very interesting case of this because she wasn't as bloodthirsty as everyone else. She definitely had her own problems, but you saw her really trying to promote certain culture. Same thing with Leshwi, we see her in the books where you're seeing more and more of the ancient singer culture come out. So while yes, they are going insane and they want to exterminate humans, they definitely are still the ancient souls of these singers, so they remember the culture it was, and they originally were tricked but still convinced that they had an existential threat that was humanity. And so having them come back and bring the culture in there was just nice little touches. It's better than just here's a demon horde that just wants to exterminate everything. It's like, no, we want to bring back what we had before everybody came in and took it from us. Even if that was wrongly held and probably a bit of an overreach. Getting into how the powers work in Roshar and for the fused specifically, the fused and the Knights Radiant both use a similar thing called surge binding. Now, once you start getting attached to Spren and do certain things with that power, then you see it take on much more interesting and unique forms. But one of the key differences to keep in mind between the Knights Radiant and fused is that, one, the fused only have access to 9 surges instead of 10. Now, the 10th surge, Adhesion, there has been numerous references to this in the series, but basically, Adhesion has something to do with the Shard honor, and because it's too much of honor, then Odium doesn't have access to it. Now, there is a bunch of debate online about whether or not this is actually the case, or if there's something that is missing from what we know, and there probably is no in Brandon. But it winds up being that we have 9 separate brands or houses of fused with specific powers to it. The second big difference between the Knights Radiant and the fused is that while the Knights Radiant with their Spren have access to 2 different surges at a time, the fused only have access to 1. So for each of the 9 surges, you'll see the fused will only have that one singular power. Now, is this makes them better or worse? There's some differences between how they use Stormlight and Voidlight and some passive and active effects, but one of the arguments that's actually brought up by a fused in the series is that the Knights Radiant have to spend half the time available on each different surge to truly master it, while the fused only has to learn one thing, and because they are able to only focus on one surge, they become so much more adept at learning it. They're not having to divide their attention. Now, the options provided to you by an extra surge, maybe that's worth the focus, but in the series we see the fused use that to devastating effect, and for the longest time we're basically winning the war, so there might be something to having only access to a single surge. I briefly touched on Regals, just as a general how that works. It is more similar to the Knights Radiant bond, so a normal Parshendi would bond with a Void Spren that would take it inside of their gem heart, and then that basically would allow them to have access to the surges. Something a bit different, and you see different powers actually displayed, but back to the fused and getting into the different brands that they have. There are 9 different sects of the fused, 1 for each surge they have available. So the Shanaim, or the Heavenly Ones, are the fused that can manipulate the surge of gravitation. This is where we see like Bentley. They are counterpart to the Windrunner order of the Knights Radiant, so they're the ones who are fighting in the sky, flying. Fun fact with them, the little differences between Voidlight and Stormlight is that they actually don't have to expend any Voidlight in order to fly. As long as they have Voidlight channeled in their like gem heart, then without actually expending any of it, they can just passively fly. Now, expend less energy in general when it comes to flying, then at first they are less good at accelerating. But if you were to do a Windrunner and a Heavenly One side by side and went for who could fly faster over a longer distance, then the Heavenly One would actually come into that competition winning. One of the other drawbacks to Voidlight, even though you can hold it for that passive effect, but something that really marks the difference between that and Stormlight is that Voidlight actually is pretty bad at healing, while Stormlight is excellent at it. So there's little counterbalances between. So even though a Heavenly One can fly without expending Stormlight, which which would be a major advantage in aerial combat. Any Knight Radiant would be able to heal much faster than they would in any different circumstance. Next is the Chattel Im, or Flowing Ones, and they're the ones who control the Surge of Abrasion. And this gives them the ability to control the force of friction between objects. Their counterpart would be the Edge Runners, so those are the ones that you're seeing just skating through and just being able to just move frictionless through the environment. We actually get to see in one of the books a really cool battle between Lift and them, and just how they actually teach Lift through example about how to use their powers more effectively. We have the Magnified Ones, which are fused to interact with the Surge of Progression. They're able to grow their carapace like very rapidly and in specific shapes, and that lets them create tools and weapons out of the carapace. It also allows for them to create extra armor around specific points of their body that they can use as weapons, and they're generally the bulkiest of any of the fused brands. You see them as kind of like walking spiky tank shells. The Mavaset Im, or Masked Ones, are fused to interact with the Surge of Illumination, so their abilities are pretty close to the Lightweaver's ability to create illusions or change their appearance, so not really the most combat focused of them, but we see Shalana in the series use that to actually great effect, so not completely useless either. The Fauna M, or those ones of alteration, are fused to interact with the Surge of Transformation, so this is pretty similar to soul casting. They're capable of transformations like turning a sword to dust or breathing out a toxic compound, and they actually, if in the case of Raboniel, can use their power to unmake sprints, which we don't know if that is something specific to Raboniel and just how far she's taken her power, or if that's something available to all of the fused of this brand. The next M, or Husk Ones, are fused to control the Surge of Transportation, so they're able to evacuate their body as a ribbon of red light, leaving behind a hollow husk of a carapace that will crumple to dust, and they can recreate their body at a destination point. So this was like the Pursuer that we saw in the last book. They are limited to a few different jumps for their powers. You would see them when they were fighting would make like up to 3 different jumps for combat, and if they start to lose, they'd use that 4th jump to flee. So if you wanted to kill one, you had to catch it on the 4th one or use a specific type of tool. We'll talk about that later. And lastly, we have the Mackay Im, or the Deepest Ones. And they are fused to control the Surge of Cohesion, and they can use that to merge with solid objects, mostly sticking to stone, and they can pass through stone. One thing though is they can't take anything with them that isn't part of their body, and they can't really see what happens when they're going through stone, so they're basically blind feeling their way through. But Sean, you said that there were 9 brands. Well, there are 2 more Surges available, with Division and Tension, but they haven't yet made an appearance in the series, so we actually don't know anything about them yet, but feel free to speculate. Now lastly, I wanted to get into a bit of lore and extra facts that I thought were just interesting about the Fused, one of which was the actual process of which the Fused would take over their host. So the way this works, and it seems to be a pretty willing exchange, is that during a Everstorm, you would have a Parshendi that would be offered up to the Fused, or to the Everstorm. And that Parshendi in particular would have to be approached by a fused spirit and then willingly take it inside of their gem heart. Now, because the fused need complete possession of the body, it's not like a sprint. When they take a sprint in there, the sprint's locked in, and while they can experience and still be somewhat aware of the experience that's happening inside the gem heart, the fused doesn't want that. Instead, they want complete control of the body, so they will go in there and they will basically eject out the soul of the Parshendi. Now that seems pretty terrifying, but the moment they do that, not only do they get access to the same body, when they eject them out and take over the body, you see them physically change in appearance. Now the fused are locked into the surge they have, so once that's done, the gem heart's filled, so unlike a Regal or a different Parshendi, they can't take on additional void sprint. They're in like that weird state where they're basically a sprint themselves. But I just thought that was kind of interesting. Secondly, every rebirth they go through, I mentioned this earlier, they go a little bit more and more insane. And something that I find interesting, and this is something that we zoom out to how the cosmere as a whole, the magic systems work. We know that with like hemalurgy, for example, the more times you actually use that to inject power into a body, the more you damage the spirit web, and that your physical perception of yourself in the spiritual realm can vastly affect like how you are as a person. Now for the sprint themselves, this is something that is much more tied into them. They have to act according to their nature. They have much less flexibility than say the humans do. So because the fused are in that weird cognitive shadow sprint state, that every time they die, they do a little bit more damage to that, and that in turn affect what I think they perceive themselves as in the spiritual realm, or regardless of the mechanism, they wind up losing a little bit of themselves each time. And what's really interesting is that it doesn't manifest uniformly throughout the Fused. We have like the Pursuer, who just starts going a little bit more mad and rabid and is less reasonable than some of his counterparts, but then you look at Raboniel, and this is a major spoiler for Rhythm of War, but we see her looking just to be done fighting. Like, even though her whole purpose was the eradication of humanity, she doesn't care who wins, she just wants to stop the thing at all, to the point where she's basically making antimatter in an attempt to blow up God. So just seeing how these type of things affect the Fused on each rebirth, it makes me wonder about what would have been the future of the Desolation if, you know, we're using the same group of actual ancient singers. If they continue to have that cycle of just fighting them off, coming back, fighting them off, coming back, fighting them off, coming back, would there have been a point where the Fused would have become a completely impotent weapon, and what would happen then? I mean, first Desolation, Odium like grabbed him up and used him like that, so I'm sure he could do that with newer worms, but it was just something that I was thinking about when I first went through this series. And lastly, it's the Legend of the Sleep. So in Parshendi Legends with the Fused, they talk about like their main purpose and their main mission is to eradicate humanity, and once they actually eradicate them, then they can return to sleep and peaceful slumber or whatever that might be. But what we do know is that they're attached to Braze, which is hell. So does that mean that once they were all won out and there were no more Parshendi that want to offer themselves up to the Fused, that they would just quietly return back to hell just so they can continuously their internal torture even though they won? Or some of them even had an interest in like life and culture and everything that happens like after the war. So what would actually happen in a world where Odium won, the Parshendi took over, and then you just have a bunch of Fused there? Like, they finally have a chance to live their lives, not just repeat desolation after desolation, trying to battle it out. So this is a complete alternate universe, but something I thought would be worth exploring. Maybe there could be like weird alternate timelines, or one of you guys can write a fan fiction about it. But what happens like afterwards when you have the immortal spirit warriors that whole purpose is to kill humanity? What happens when there isn't humanity? They just quietly go off and leave the stage, or are they the kind of powerful things that could then continue to rule society? Because they are so much higher in like the Parshendi hierarchy, it doesn't seem like something they would just like cautiously go off to. But this has been another Cosmere ramble. I'm gonna link a few of the YouTube sites that I found that are more dedicated to this type of content. I always enjoy doing this when I'm stuck on a specific book in particular, because I'm trying to not just divvy up my attention, because for some of these books that I'm trying to review and get through, they just take so long to actually read and finish, and having a bunch of stuff happen in life outside of YouTube. In general, right now my time has been much more limited, so this was something that I originally thought I could do in like a few days, and as I started diving into the lore and trying to piece everything together, it turned out to be a much bigger task than I originally thought it would be. But if you like this type of content, let me know. I've done one other one. I do want to branch out away from the Cosmere. I think it's funny that I haven't reviewed any of the Cosmere books yet, but I'm now on like video 7 of just Cosmere specific content. So at one point I will pick up the Way of Kings again, or Mistborn, or something, and start reviewing these books. I appreciate you guys stopping by and watching this video, and as always, take it easy.